Imagine stepping into Renaissance Rome in the spring of 1502, a city alive with secrets, power, and incense. The air is thick with the scent of roses and melted wax. Beneath the echo of cathedral bells, nobles in velvet and gold whisper behind painted fans, their eyes fixed on a young woman standing at the altar, Lucrezia Borgia. She's only 22, but her name already trembles on every tongue in Italy, daughter of a pope, sister to a feared warlord, and the subject of more rumors than sermons. Tonight she's not just a bride, she's a symbol, a pawn, and perhaps the most dangerous woman in Rome. Across from her stands Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara, a man who knows that this marriage is not born of love but of politics. This isn't a wedding of hearts. It's a negotiation between dynasties. Every candle, every blessing, every smile hides calculation. The Pope seeks to bind Ferrara to his empire of influence. The Este family demands proof that the union is real, binding, and legitimate in the eyes of both God and power. As night falls over the marble city, what should have been a moment of intimacy becomes something far more unsettling. A performance. Witnesses will stand where lovers should be alone, and a private vow will turn into public evidence. In a world where bloodlines decide the fate of kingdoms, Lucrezia's wedding night will mark not just the start of a marriage, but the birth of one of history's most scandalous legends. Her story begins here, in the glow of 1,000 candles where politics and passion collide. Rome, 1502. The air itself seems to vibrate with anticipation. The cobblestones of the eternal city gleam after a light evening rain, reflecting the glow of torches carried by guards in papal livery. The streets are lined with spectators craning their necks for a glimpse of history in motion. The wedding procession of Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, a woman whose name already carries the weight of myth, scandal, and fascination. Tonight, Rome is not just a city. It is a stage. Every archway, every dome, every flicker of light becomes part of an elaborate performance where power, faith, and desire converge. And at the center of it all stands a young woman draped in ivory silk, her beauty so refined that even her enemies cannot deny it. Inside the palazzo, where the ceremony will take place, the atmosphere is almost suffocating in its grandeur. Tapestries depicting biblical triumphs line the walls, ceilings shimmer with gold leaf. The air smells of incense, roses, and something else, ambition. Dozens of candles burn in silver candelabra, casting waves of warm light across the marble floor polished to a mirror shine. Every detail has been chosen not merely to celebrate love, but to broadcast power. This wedding is not a union. It is a declaration. To the outside world, it is the joyous joining of two noble houses, the Borgias of Rome and the Estes of Ferrara. But to those who know better, to the diplomats, cardinals, and merchants who whisper from behind feathered masks, it is something far more deliberate. It is an alliance forged in the crucible of necessity, sealed not with affection but with strategy. For Pope Alexander VI, this marriage is another masterstroke in a lifetime of political chess. Through his daughter, he can extend papal influence beyond the Tiber, binding Ferrara to the Vatican's orbit. His ambition knows no borders, and his love for family is inseparable from his hunger for dominion. The Pope has elevated his children to power as no pontiff before him ever dared. Cesare as the sword of the Church, Lucrezia as its diplomatic hand. And yet, the murmurs never stop. Rome's taverns and drawing rooms hum with tales of poisonings, betrayals, and whispered sin. Some call the Borgias brilliant, others monstrous, but all agree they are impossible to ignore. As the cathedral bells toll, their deep resonance rolls through the palazzo like thunder. Courtiers turn their heads toward the grand staircase, where Lucrezia makes her entrance. Her gown, embroidered with gold thread and seed pearls, catches the candlelight like fire. Her hair, a cascade of burnished gold, is bound by a veil of lace finer than breath. Yet it is her expression that holds the room, serene, poised, and impenetrable. She descends each step slowly, deliberately, her eyes fixed ahead. Around her, whispers ripple like wind through reeds. "That is the Pope's daughter," someone murmurs. "The one whose husband died mysteriously. Or was murdered. She looks so calm, doesn't she?" Lucrezia hears none of it, or perhaps she hears everything and simply refuses to let it touch her. She has learned to live beneath the gaze of judgment. In Rome, reputation is both armor and weapon, and she wears hers with the composure of a general. At the altar waits Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, tall, dignified, wrapped in black velvet trimmed with crimson silk. His face is handsome in a restrained way, marked by intelligence and a quiet, strategic caution. For him, too, this day is not about romance. It is about survival. Aligning with the papal family means wealth, influence, and protection, but also risk. The Borgias are power incarnate, and power burns as easily as it blesses. When their eyes meet, something unspoken passes between them. Not tenderness but understanding. They are both children of their age, products of ambition, instruments of dynasty. They will play their parts well. The ceremony begins. A cardinal intones solemn prayers, his voice echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. Latin syllables weave through incense smoke as the couple kneels before the altar. The congregation watches in reverent silence, but behind folded hands, thoughts run dark and fast. This is not merely a sacrament, it is a spectacle of politics disguised as piety. Outside, the city listens. Bells from the Basilica of St. Peter answer those of the Lateran. Merchants pause mid-trade. Prostitutes cross themselves. Beggars look up from the gutters. For one moment, all of Rome seems to inhale the same breath. When the vows are spoken, the crowd inside erupts in applause that feels more like relief. The Pope's men exchange glances. The alliance has been sealed. The musicians begin to play, and servants carry in trays of sugared fruits, roasted peacocks, and red wine that glows like garnet in the torchlight. But beneath the laughter, the tension hums on. Every guest knows that this marriage is more than it seems. It will ripple through courts and kingdoms, reshaping alliances and provoking rivalries. For the Borgias, it is a victory, for Ferrara, a gamble. And for Lucrezia, no one dares to guess. She moves through the reception like a practiced diplomat. Every smile measured, every glance purposeful. She thanks ambassadors, greets nobles, accepts toasts, and deflects insinuations. Even those who distrust her cannot help but be charmed. She is not the naive girl they expected. There is steel beneath her grace. In a corner of the hall, two Venetian envoys whisper to each other. "She's more dangerous than her brother," one says. "Not dangerous," replies the other. "Just smarter." As the feast continues, Alfonso watches his new wife. He sees not a scandal but a survivor. Perhaps even an equal. Around them, the flicker of candles reflects in silver goblets and jeweled mirrors, multiplying their image into eternity, two figures locked in a dance that neither chose, yet both understand. The orchestra swells, the guests cheer, and the Pope smiles his knowing smile. But high above the revelry, the frescoed saints painted on the ceiling seem to watch in silence, their painted eyes filled with judgment. Because everyone here knows the truth. In Renaissance Italy, nothing is ever sacred for long. When the music fades, the nobles disperse into smaller circles of gossip. Words like consummation, alliance, and heir whisper through the air like smoke. Each phrase heavy with implication. What happens after tonight will determine whether this marriage becomes legend or disaster. Lucrezia stands by a window overlooking the dark streets of Rome. Beyond the palace walls, the city sleeps uneasily, a maze of power and peril. Her reflection in the glass looks almost like another woman, one born of duty rather than desire. Behind her, Alfonso approaches quietly. "Do you ever grow tired of being watched?" he asks softly. She turns to him, her expression calm but her eyes alive. "You don't survive in Rome by wishing for privacy," she answers. "You survive by giving them something worth watching." And with that, she walks past him into the golden light of the banquet hall, poised, radiant, untouchable. The stage is set. The actors are ready. And the world waits for the next act in the most calculated love story of the Renaissance. The ceremony has ended, but the echo of its chants still lingers in the air like smoke that refuses to fade. Within the marble halls of the palazzo, a new rhythm takes over, the rhythm of whispers, footsteps, and the muted clinking of goblets. The feast is beginning. Outside, Rome glows under a sky heavy with clouds and expectation. Inside, the world of politics and pageantry continues to spin. This is no ordinary celebration. It is the beginning of a fragile alliance between two families whose ambitions could either bind or destroy them. At the center of it all stands Lucrezia Borgia, her composure immaculate. The gown she wears, white silk threaded with gold, moves like liquid light. Her smile is courteous, her gestures deliberate. Every movement is measured, calculated, rehearsed through years of surviving the court's relentless scrutiny. To most of the guests, she is an enigma. Some see her as the Pope's pampered daughter, a pawn on her father's chessboard. Others, more astute, recognize something deeper, a survivor of scandal who has learned to play the game with quiet precision. At 22, Lucrezia has already lived the lives of several women. She has been wife, widow, and outcast. Each title carved a scar, but also a lesson. The daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, she was raised in a world where affection and ambition walked hand in hand. Her father taught her that power is never given, only traded. Her brother Cesare Borgia, the ruthless condottiero, taught her that loyalty is currency and betrayal its inevitable cost. And yet, beneath that gilded surface, Lucrezia is more than a vessel for her family's ambition. She is a woman who has learned to see clearly in the half-light of intrigue. As she moves through the hall, courtiers part to let her pass. She offers a polite nod to one group of ambassadors and a faint smile to a French cardinal who has whispered too many stories about her. Her presence commands silence. Her voice, when she speaks, is low and melodious, carefully neutral, yet every word carries weight. Across the room, Alfonso d'Este watches her from the head of the table. He is everything his lineage demands: composed, intelligent, restrained. His hands, gloved in black, rest on the carved arms of his chair, but his mind is already calculating the days to come. The Borgia alliance promises much: papal favor, trade advantages, perhaps even protection against Venice and Milan. But it also brings risk. Rome's alliances are built on sand. What glitters tonight could burn tomorrow. He studies his new wife, the woman who embodies that uncertainty. What he sees surprises him. She is not the timid creature described by his advisors, nor the manipulative siren painted by Rome's gossip. Instead, he sees calm resolve, and something else, a quiet intelligence that mirrors his own. Their marriage, forged by politics, might yet become something more enduring, a partnership of survival. The feast reaches its crescendo. Music rises from the gallery, a swelling harmony of lutes and viols. Servants move gracefully among the tables, bearing silver platters piled high with roasted pheasant, figs, and candied oranges. Wine flows freely, filling jeweled cups with ruby liquid that glimmers like blood in the candlelight. To an outsider, it looks like paradise. But in every corner of the room, eyes watch, ears listen, minds calculate. A Florentine envoy whispers to his companion, "If this alliance holds, Ferrara gains the Pope's blessing. If it fails, they'll fall with him." "And the girl?" the companion asks. "She's the key. She always has been." Lucrezia pretends not to notice the murmurs. She has heard far worse. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had called her a liability before accusing her of impossible sins to justify their annulment. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, had loved her briefly, until love became inconvenient, and ended violently, leaving her haunted by whispers of her own family's hand in his death. Now, as she lifts a goblet to her lips, she feels the weight of those ghosts pressing close. But she also feels something new: determination. This time, she will not simply endure the story written for her. She will edit it word by word. She glances toward Alfonso, who returns her gaze with a polite inclination of the head. Neither smiles. They don't need to. They both understand what is required of them tonight: appearances, grace, unity. The illusion of harmony, at least until it becomes real. When the toasts begin, Pope Alexander VI rises first, his crimson robes billowing as he gestures grandly to the crowd. "Let this union be blessed," he proclaims, "for it binds Rome and Ferrara in friendship, in strength, and in the will of God." The crowd cheers, glasses raised high. The Pope's voice booms through the hall, equal parts paternal affection and political theater. He is a man who loves spectacle as much as salvation. But beneath his words lies an unspoken truth: this marriage is insurance. The Vatican's enemies are many, and alliances are the walls that keep them at bay. As the cheering subsides, Cesare Borgia steps forward, tall, charismatic, eyes cold as polished steel. He bows to his sister, kisses her hand, and whispers something only she can hear. "Ferrara is lucky," he says softly, "though they don't know it yet." Lucrezia's answer is a measured smile. "Neither do you," she replies. For a brief moment, they are siblings again, bound by blood and shared secrets. Then Cesare turns away, his armor glinting in the light, and the moment dissolves. The night grows older, and the mood shifts from celebration to tension. Outside, thunder murmurs in the distance, as if echoing the storm within the palazzo. The laughter becomes thinner, the conversations more pointed. Somewhere, a lute string snaps, an omen unnoticed by most but not by Lucrezia. When she finally steps away from the feast, the air feels cooler, cleaner. She finds herself in one of the palace's corridors, where frescoes of saints stare down with timeless disapproval. The flicker of her torchlight dances across their painted faces, blurring holiness with judgment. She pauses at a window overlooking the courtyard. The city sprawls beneath her, endless and restless. The same Rome that worships her name today may curse it tomorrow. Yet in this moment she feels strangely calm. Behind her, footsteps echo. Alfonso appears at her side. "Do you miss Rome already?" he asks, his tone even, almost detached. She shakes her head. "Rome never leaves you. It waits. It watches." He studies her profile, the strength in her jaw, the sadness in her eyes. "You carry yourself like someone who expects to be betrayed." Lucrezia turns to him. "Because in Rome, that's how you stay alive." A small silence stretches between them, not hostile but heavy with mutual recognition. They understand each other in ways words cannot explain. Both born into families where affection is a weapon, both conditioned to trust no one completely. At last, Alfonso nods. "Then perhaps," he says quietly, "we will survive this together." The words hang in the air like a fragile truce. Far below, the bells of the city toll once more. The feast continues, but within the walls of the palazzo, a different kind of union has begun. One not of hearts, but of minds. Lucrezia looks toward the distant horizon, where the faintest blush of dawn threatens to touch the sky. The night has not yet ended, but the stage is set for something far larger than any of them can imagine. In the court of Rome and Ferrara, love will always serve politics. But perhaps, in this unlikely pair, politics will one day serve something greater. And as the first light creeps across the marble floor, Lucrezia whispers almost to herself, "Let them watch. I'll give them a performance they'll never forget." Midnight descends over Rome like a velvet curtain. The echoes of the wedding feast fade into distant laughter and the fading notes of lutes. The torches in the grand hall burn low, their light bending across marble floors now littered with petals and spilled wine. But within the thick walls of the palazzo, the true performance, the one that will define the night, is about to begin. The hour is late, yet the palace is far from asleep. Servants move in silence, faces averted, their footsteps soft on the polished stone. Candles are lit in the upper chambers, one by one, like the quiet rising of anticipation. Whispers run through the corridors, nervous, urgent, careful. Everyone knows what is to come, yet no one dares to speak of it openly. In the Renaissance, marriage is never a private affair. It is contract, spectacle, proof, and tonight proof is demanded. The Este family, cautious and pragmatic, has insisted that the union between their heir Alfonso and the infamous daughter of Pope Alexander VI must be witnessed, confirmed, beyond any shadow of rumor. For Lucrezia, the command cuts deep. She has endured gossip, accusations, even slanderous myths that painted her as both temptress and victim. But nothing has prepared her for this, a ritual designed to erase doubt at the cost of dignity. Still, she will comply. She must. The survival of her family's alliance and her own future depends on it. The private chamber prepared for the couple is a masterpiece of luxury. Velvet draperies fall from a gilded canopy. Silver basins of rose water gleam in the candlelight. The air is thick with perfume and something heavier, expectation. Outside the door, guards stand rigid, their faces expressionless. Inside, a few chosen witnesses await, a papal cleric, 2 Este courtiers, and a pair of matrons charged with attestation. It is a grotesque tradition disguised as propriety, a relic of a world where bloodlines mean more than souls. Lucrezia stands by the window, the night air cooling her fevered skin. Below, the courtyard lies silent, only the faint sound of hooves echoing as the last guests depart. The moonlight cuts through the curtains, casting a pale ribbon across her gown. Her hands tremble slightly, though her face betrays nothing. She has been trained for moments like this. Moments when control is the only shield left. Behind her, the door creaks. Alfonso enters, his expression unreadable. He wears no crown tonight, no armor, only the weight of duty. His gaze flickers to the witnesses, then back to her. For a heartbeat, neither speaks. Finally, Lucrezia breaks the silence. "So this is how history will remember us," she says quietly. Alfonso's jaw tightens. "History remembers power," he replies. "Not discomfort." There is no malice in his tone, only resignation. They are both prisoners of their age, trapped in a ritual neither created nor condones. The cleric clears his throat softly, an attempt at ceremony. My lady, my lord, the sanctity of marriage must be affirmed before God and man. His words sound hollow, rehearsed, stripped of compassion. Lucrezia turns slowly toward him. God, she murmurs, witnesses everything already. The priest lowers his gaze. And so the ritual begins. The servants draw the heavy curtains closed. The witnesses take their assigned places at a discreet distance, though the concept of discretion tonight is a cruel illusion. The candles cast long shadows across the walls, and in that dim light, the line between devotion and degradation vanishes completely. It is said that the act was completed not once, but 3 times, each repetition an assurance, a desperate attempt to silence the insatiable hunger for proof. Whether this is truth or legend hardly matters. The fact that it could be demanded at all reveals the brutality of the time. What survives in the records is not the act itself, but its consequences. The murmurs that spread through the corridors afterward, the looks exchanged by courtiers who pretended not to know, the quiet endurance of the woman at the center of it all. When it is finally over, the chamber falls into a heavy silence. The witnesses withdraw one by one, their faces masks of solemnity. The priest mutters a prayer that sounds more like apology than blessing. Lucrezia remains still, seated on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the dying flame of a candle. Her hair has fallen loose around her shoulders, the gold of it dimmed by shadow. She feels hollow, not broken but emptied. There is a difference and she clings to that difference. Alfonso stands a few steps away, silent, his hands clenched at his sides. He does not approach her, nor does she look at him. They both understand that what just happened has less to do with them as individuals and more with the machine of power grinding endlessly around them. After a long moment he speaks, his voice low, hoarse. They will stop talking now. Lucrezia exhales slowly. No, she says. They will never stop. But at least now their words mean less than mine. It is the first sign of defiance, a small spark glowing beneath the ashes. Outside, dawn begins to brush the horizon with faint strokes of pink and gold. The bells of St. Peter's toll for morning prayer. Rome awakens, indifferent to the humiliation endured within these gilded walls. Yet within that indifference lies the paradox of power. No one remembers the witnesses, the cleric, or even the details. They remember her. Lucrezia rises, gathering the silk of her gown, her movements precise, deliberate. The performance is over and she has survived it. That, in her world, is victory enough. When she steps into the corridor, the guards bow their heads, not in pity but in respect. She walks past them without hesitation, her posture unshaken. The rumors that will inevitably follow, about what happened, how many times, cannot touch her now. In their eagerness to humiliate her, they have given her something far more enduring, a legend. By the time she returns to her chambers, the palace is alive with morning noise. Servants relight torches, courtiers trade half-truths over breakfast, and somewhere in the distance Cesare Borgia's laughter echoes, sharp, knowing, and dangerous. Later that day, dispatches will leave Rome for every major court in Italy. The messages are brief and triumphant. The marriage between Lucrezia Borgia and Alfonso d'Este has been confirmed in full accordance with custom. To the Este family, it is reassurance. To the Borgias, it is leverage. To history, it becomes a scandal whispered for centuries. But to Lucrezia, it is something else entirely. A pivot, a crossing point between the life she has endured and the one she will shape for herself. That evening, when she finally sits alone by her window, she watches the light shift across the rooftops of Rome. The city looks softer now, as if forgiven by the sunrise. She feels the exhaustion deep in her bones, but also a strange clarity. What was meant to strip her of dignity has, in some twisted way, reinforced her strength. She has learned that survival is not about purity or reputation. It is about endurance. She thinks of the future, Ferrara, a court far from the Vatican's shadow, where she might rebuild her name not as scandal but as influence. She imagines salons of poets and painters, conversations that will drown out the noise of rumor. For the first time in years, she allows herself a small, genuine smile. The night that was meant to define her shame has instead revealed her power. History will remember the spectacle, the candles, the witnesses, the grotesque ritual. But in the quiet truth of dawn, only Lucrezia knows what it truly meant, not submission but transformation. The proof they demanded has been given, but the proof of her spirit is still unfolding. And one day, they will not remember her for the scandal of her wedding night, but for how she turned that humiliation into sovereignty. The sun rose over Rome with a cruel brilliance, painting the city's domes and towers in gold, as if mocking the darkness that had passed. Inside the palazzo, the celebration had ended, but the aftermath lingered in every echoing corridor. Servants swept away petals from marble floors still sticky with spilled wine. Courtiers whispered over breakfast, exchanging theories and embellishments about what had transpired behind closed doors. And at the center of it all, as always, stood Lucrezia Borgia. She emerged that morning dressed in pale blue silk, her hair neatly braided, her expression composed. Not a tremor betrayed what she had endured. To those watching, she looked untouched by scandal, immune to humiliation. But those closest to power knew, this kind of serenity was armor forged from fire. Whispers followed her like shadows. They always did. Did you hear? It was witnessed, not once but 3 times. They say she faced it like a queen. No, like a prisoner. Every word carried both fascination and fear. In the delicate hierarchy of Rome, Lucrezia was no longer just the Pope's daughter. She was now a symbol, the living intersection of politics, faith, and female endurance. The Este envoys were satisfied, the Borgia loyalists triumphant. The proof had been delivered, the alliance solidified. Yet, beneath the surface, a quiet fury brewed, not in Rome's courts but within Lucrezia herself. For the first time, she understood that power was not only something men seized through armies or thrones. It was something a woman could wield through resilience, through perception, through the ability to endure humiliation and still walk out unbroken. That afternoon, the Pope summoned her to his private chambers. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, was in his late 60s but still imposing, his voice rich, his gestures theatrical. His papal robes gleamed with gold thread as he stretched out his arms in paternal triumph. "My dearest daughter," he said, rising from his chair, "you have done what few could. You have silenced them all. The alliance with Ferrara will hold. You've secured our future." Lucrezia curtsied gracefully. "I did what was expected of me, father." He smiled, mistaking her restraint for obedience. "Expected? My child, you did more than that. You redeemed our name before all of Italy." She hesitated. "Then why do I feel as if I've paid for it with something I can never reclaim?" The Pope's smile faltered for an instant, just long enough to reveal the man behind the tiara. But it was gone as quickly as it came. He took her hand, pressed it gently. "Power always demands a price. You, of all people, should understand that now." She did. And for the first time she no longer felt like his daughter but his equal, or perhaps his rival. Days turned into weeks. The wedding's infamy spread across Italy like wildfire. Poets mocked it in secret verses. Priests condemned it from pulpits. Yet paradoxically it made the Borgias stronger. No one dared question the legitimacy of the union now. The Este family, bound by both politics and spectacle, had no choice but to embrace their new duchess. The Papal States thrived on the illusion of unity. And Lucrezia, silent, observant, calculating, began to adapt. When she arrived in Ferrara later that year, the reception was cold. The court was refined, intellectual, and proud of its lineage. They viewed the Borgias as gaudy interlopers, vulgar pretenders cloaked in piety. At her first banquet as duchess, every glance was a test, every compliment a trap. "Your Holiness's daughter," one lady said sweetly, "you must find our little city quieter than Rome." Lucrezia smiled. "Quieter, yes. But I find truth often travels more softly than rumor." Laughter rippled, polite but sharp-edged. She had drawn first blood and done so with grace. Slowly she began to reshape perception. She hosted salons where music, poetry, and philosophy intertwined. She patronized artists, commissioned works that glorified Ferrara's heritage rather than her own. Each gesture chipped away at suspicion. Her intelligence, her eloquence, her ability to listen without judgment, these became her tools. In a world that had used her body to prove alliances, she now used her mind to command respect. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Cesare Borgia continued his conquests. His armies cut through Italy with the Pope's blessing, carving out territories under the banner of divine authority. But even Cesare, ruthless as he was, admired his sister's transformation. He once wrote to her, "You rule better with conversation than I with swords." And she did. Her court became a beacon of Renaissance brilliance. Scholars debated Plato and Machiavelli under her patronage. Painters immortalized her image not as sinner or saint, but as sovereign. Yet she never forgot the night Rome demanded proof of her worth. It became her quiet motivation, a scar turned into a weapon. One winter evening, as Ferrara glittered with snow, Lucrezia found herself standing on the balcony of the ducal palace. The city stretched beneath her, its rooftops glowing with torchlight. Beside her, Alfonso joined her silently. "The world still talks about us," he said with a faint smile. "They always will," she replied. "But I've learned to decide what they say." He looked at her, truly looked, perhaps for the first time. "You've changed." She turned to him. "No," she said softly. "I've become what I was forced to be." For a long time they stood together in silence. The distance between them, once defined by duty, had softened into something like respect. It was not love, not yet, but it was the seed of partnership. By the time her father's reign began to crumble years later, Lucrezia had long ceased to be anyone's pawn. When Alexander VI died in 1503, the papal court erupted in chaos. Cesare lost his armies, his fortune, his health. Rome turned on its former masters. But in Ferrara the Duchess stood untouched. Her marriage, once a weapon of her father's design, had become her fortress. She wrote letters to the new pope, securing her position through diplomacy rather than force. Her reputation, once defined by scandal, was now reborn in words like grace, wisdom, and magnanimity. What began as a humiliation had evolved into power of the purest kind, the power to reinvent. Years later, chroniclers would debate her legacy. Some would still call her the Borgia temptress, others a victim of circumstance. But the truth, the one hidden beneath frescoes and courtly gossip, was simpler and sharper. Lucrezia Borgia had learned the ultimate art of survival, to turn what was used against her into the very source of her strength. Her composure was not innocence, it was mastery. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. Her endurance was not weakness, it was sovereignty. She lived in a world where women were measured by purity or scandal, and she became something far rarer, an institution. As the years passed, she ruled Ferrara with quiet authority. Her salons flourished. Her children grew under her watchful eye. The same world that once shamed her now celebrated her as the embodiment of Renaissance grace. Sometimes, late at night, when the torches burned low, she would stand again at the window and remember the cold candlelight of that first night, the humiliation, the witnesses, the silence afterward. And she would smile. Because that night, meant to break her, had instead built her, brick by brick, gaze by gaze, whisper by whisper, into the woman who outlived her enemies, outwrote her scandals, and outlasted her time. Ferrara did not open its arms, it opened its eyes. The duchy was elegant in the way of places that believed themselves complete, courtyards planned like music, facades reading like Latin verse, and people who knew precisely where to stand in a painting. The Este court prized refinement, lineage, and a cultivated suspicion of outsiders. When Lucrezia Borgia arrived, the courtiers' smiles were polished and cool, as if they had been stored in silver cases and brought out only for state occasions. She sensed the temperature the instant she stepped from her litter: admiration for her beauty, fascination with her notoriety, and a steady undercurrent of doubt. Borgia was a word that entered rooms before she did. So she did not try to outshout the word. She decided to change the room. Her first gesture was quiet, a private supper for a handful of poets and musicians, held not in the grand sala but in a smaller chamber with a carved walnut ceiling and a fresco of Orpheus taming a disorderly world with song. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she asked disarming questions. About meter, about tuning, about the way a line of Petrarch could be made to glow if you placed it next to a line of Ariosto. The artists left that night uncertain of what, exactly, had happened, only that the conversation felt like light being poured into the corners. Word spread. Not scandal this time but invitation. A salon began to take shape, first fortnightly, then weekly, its center of gravity not the Duchess's rank but her curiosity. Scholars arrived with manuscripts still smelling of ink. Lutenists tried new airs under tapestries that softened the winter drafts. A young painter spread cartoons on a table while Lucrezia traced the sweep of a composition with one finger, seeing the story hidden in the chalk. She had learned in Rome that spectacle impresses the powerful. In Ferrara she learned that attention wins them. When a minor poet read a sonnet that stumbled, she asked him to read it again, slower, then offered a gentler word for his harshest line. When a mathematician explained a clockwork he was building, she asked him to tell it to her as if it were a parable. "What does time do to us," she said, "when it is not watched?" He stared at her, then laughed, then answered in a speech so clear that the room itself seemed to understand. Patronage followed naturally, not as largesse flung from a balcony, but as threads deliberately woven. She commissioned a triptych that honored the Este lineage while setting the central panel in a garden of learning and mercy. She asked that the Madonna's eyes look not at the heavens but, gently, at the people who approached. She funded a small press to copy classical texts and letters of contemporary women. The binding carried the Este device, not her initials. She asked for no signatures in return. She requested dedications to Ferrara itself. It was a lesson in optics and allegiance. Raise the city and you rise with it. The gossip shifted. The word Borgia began to shed some of its sulfur and acquire a glaze of humanist polish. A Mantuan envoy wrote home that the Duchess had a mind like a mirror. What you put before it returns to you brighter. A skeptical canon, attending a salon purely to be unimpressed, found himself arguing about Augustine with a silk merchant and going home with a new respect for both. In public, Lucrezia's gestures were ceremonial perfection. In private they were tactical. She learned the fault lines of Ferrara, who owed old favors to Venice, who envied Mantua's theater, who still grieved a lost campaign and preferred Homer to Virgil because Homer did not pretend the world was fair. She wrote letters with temperature control, warm to Florence when Florence was brittle, cooler to Rome when Rome demanded heat. She avoided words that sounded like orders. She preferred alignment, a craft learned at a cost. Her marriage also changed by small degrees. With Alfonso d'Este, she practiced a discipline uncommon to dynastic unions, telling truths in portions a day could absorb. She did not speak of humiliation, she spoke of usefulness. "If we are loved," she told him on a night of soft rain, "let it be for what we build." He looked at her, truly looked, and answered, "Then let's build something that makes even our enemies nostalgic for us when we're gone." A line too grand for a ledger, perhaps, but precisely right for a program. They began to move in tandem. Alfonso strengthened foundries and river works. Lucrezia strengthened salons and schools. He mounted festivals that displayed Ferrara's military precision. She choreographed pageants that displayed its learning. In council they did not contradict each other in public. In private they permitted correction. The court noticed. Respect, that shy animal, came closer. Motherhood arrived like sunrise through shutters, unexpectedly soft, then flooding everything. The births, celebrations in a city that measured hope in heirs, also offered Lucrezia a new grammar of influence. She made the nursery a curriculum: music at dawn, letters at noon, a walk in the herb garden at dusk where she named plants for their virtues as well as their uses: rosemary for remembrance, rue for repentance, laurel for what you must earn and never wear too early. Nurses learned lullabies from visiting musicians. A tutor drafted reading lists that moved from Aesop's bones to Cicero's logic to the tender martial honesty of Plutarch. The Duchess insisted on kindness as protocol. The children grew into little citizens with steady hands. Ferrara began to see itself reflected in her, not merely adorned but coherent. When famine threatened a neighboring province, the Duchess organized a grain relief convoy that departed before the petitioners finished their bow. When a flood snarled trade, she turned a scheduled banquet into a benefit for river laborers' families, turning generosity into a public pleasure. She did it without sermon, with only a line at the end of her remarks: "A city is a chorus, even the quiet voices are music." Rome kept tugging at her sleeve. Letters arrived bearing the papal seal, some affectionate, some edged, all reminding her that the old world did not forget its instruments. She answered with diplomacy's most elegant weapon: delay. When delay would not do, she answered with clarity: no barbs, no perfume, just statements laid like stones across a stream so that even a hurried man could cross without falling. She never wrote more than necessary, she never wrote less than sufficient. Not everyone forgave her past. There were faces that stiffened when she entered. There were prayers said against her under breath. She learned to outlast rather than overthrow. Time, she understood, is the only gossip with a perfect memory. If you keep your shape long enough, time will repeat your outline without malice. One winter, the court hosted a debate on whether beauty reforms the soul or merely distracts it. A philosopher argued for distraction. A painter argued that beauty is a kind of truth wearing a dress. They turned to the Duchess for judgment. She smiled. Beauty without mercy is decoration. Mercy without beauty is hard to hear. Ferrara will practice both. The room murmured as if a plucked string had resolved. The decision became policy. Alms paired with apprenticeships, festivals paired with food drives, church repairs paired with scholarships for stonemasons' daughters. Her enemies recalculated. They found themselves admiring programs they had intended to oppose. Dignity proved contagious, so did competence. On a spring evening soaked in orange light, a caravan from Florence arrived with silk bolts shot through with silver. The merchant, bowing, presented a book as well, a small, exquisite volume of songs copied for the Duchess's hand. Lucrezia turned the pages and stopped at a line written in a steady, unknown script. Power, in a lower voice, endures. She closed the book and smiled, as if a secret she had long suspected had introduced itself politely. In later years, travelers would speak of Ferrara as a place where brightness did not bruise, where music seemed to know math and justice learned to wear velvet. They would credit dukes and architects and armies as histories do. But those who had sat in the small chamber under the walnut ceiling knew the source. It was a woman who had been taught, brutally, that her body could be turned into proof, and who had answered by turning her mind into policy, her taste into infrastructure, her patience into law. She did not erase the word Borgia. She reframed it. She pressed it like a seal into wax already scented with cypress and ink and fresh bread. By the time the seal cooled, the impression read, Duchess, patron, mother, stateswoman. When the bells of Ferrara rang for feast days, she sometimes stood in the loggia and listened to the city breathe. The sound was not the roar of armies or the clatter of coins. It was softer, the hush of pages turning, a rehearsal tuning up, a market agreeing on fair weights. She thought then of the narrow Roman chamber where shame had been staged for witnesses, and she did not flinch. The witnesses were long gone. The work remained. And work, unlike scandal, accumulates. By the time the new century unfolded, Ferrara no longer whispered about Lucrezia Borgia. It listened to her. The city had changed beneath her steady gaze. Its streets, once narrow and suspicious of newcomers, now pulsed with music and ideas. Artists painted under her patronage. Scholars debated in her salons. Poets dedicated verses not to her beauty but to her clarity. The name that had once dripped with scandal in Rome now glowed like polished gold in the halls of Ferrara. And yet, the Duchess knew that power was never permanent. It was a performance, a negotiation renewed each dawn. In the candlelit quiet of her private chamber, Lucrezia sat at a mahogany desk piled with parchment. Her handwriting, precise, elegant, deliberate, moved across a letter to a Florentine envoy. The ink glimmered like obsidian. Tell them, she wrote, that Ferrara stands ready to mediate, not to dominate. Wisdom outlasts fear. When she sealed it with red wax, pressing the Este crest into the molten pool, she smiled faintly. It was the same gesture her father had once used when sending orders to armies. But her battles were fought with words, not swords. Outside, the ducal gardens stretched under the silver light of a winter moon. Statues of Apollo and Minerva stood sentinel among frost-tipped roses. The air smelled of cedar and ink, a scent she had grown to love. It had been nearly 2 decades since that infamous wedding night in Rome. The candlelight humiliation that once defined her was now a distant echo. Yet sometimes, in the half-silence before dawn, she still heard the creak of doors, the murmured prayers of witnesses, the forced stillness of that moment. But it no longer wounded her. It reminded her. She had been reduced to a spectacle, and from it she had learned how to master spectacle itself. Ferrara thrived under her touch. The duchy became a jewel of the Italian Renaissance, a sanctuary of art and reason between the warring ambitions of Venice, Florence, and the Papal States. Visitors spoke of a court where one might find Aristotle quoted by candlelight and madrigals composed before breakfast. Lucrezia presided over it not as a monarch, but as an architect of atmosphere. She curated not just art but tone. At her salons she demanded conversation, not flattery. She rewarded ideas, not obedience. Her table was open to theologians and painters alike, and she delighted in the friction between them. When a scholar argued that faith was the enemy of beauty, she smiled and replied, "Then perhaps beauty is the shape faith takes when it is finally understood." The remark spread through Italy faster than any rumor ever had. The Vatican, ever suspicious of her autonomy, watched from afar, torn between admiration and unease. The daughter of Pope Alexander VI had become the embodiment of everything the Church feared most. a woman whose virtue came not from submission but from intellect. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, once a cold contract, had transformed into a quiet alliance of minds. He governed with steel, she with silk. He managed soldiers, she managed perception. When disagreements arose, they spoke behind closed doors, their arguments tempered not by affection but by respect. They had come to understand each other not as lovers trapped in duty, but as co-conspirators in stability. At state audiences, they were perfectly synchronized. The Duke's measured words followed by the Duchess's temperate counsel. Ambassadors noticed it. One Venetian envoy wrote home, "Ferrara is governed by two hands, one iron, one velvet, and neither ever trembles." Then tragedy visited as it always does when life grows too harmonious. A fever swept through the palace. Physicians whispered of bad air, of summer's rot carried by the river. Within weeks, the plague crept into Ferrara's walls, taking servants, courtiers, even a beloved child. Lucrezia did not retreat. She moved through the sick rooms with lavender cloth pressed to her face, directing physicians, comforting families, praying beside those no priest dared to approach. The city watched its duchess risk her life not from spectacle, but from duty. When the fever passed, her hair had gone paler, streaked with white like threads of moonlight. Yet her eyes burned brighter than ever, steady, unflinching, almost serene. The people began to call her Madonna della Pace, Our Lady of Peace. Years slipped by, measured not in victories but in survival. Her salons continued, her letters multiplied, her children grew into alliances of their own. Rome sent envoys now with requests, not accusations. Poets immortalized her as a living paradox, gentle yet shrewd, kind yet impenetrable. Still, there were nights when she walked the corridors alone, her footsteps echoing through marble and memory. The portraits on the walls, her father, her brother Cesare, men who had defined entire eras through ambition, stared down at her. She would pause beneath their eyes, whispering softly, "You conquered the world. I rebuilt what you broke." It was not pride. It was simply truth. One evening, as dusk burned red across the Ferrara sky, a messenger arrived from Rome. His cloak was dusted with road grime, his face gaunt from travel. He brought news that Pope Julius II, the fierce enemy of her family, had died. Lucrezia read the letter slowly. Then she folded it, set it down beside her cup, and exhaled. The age of the Borgias was truly over. But her story, she knew, was only now being understood. That night she sat before a mirror. Not to admire herself, those days were long past, but to study the architecture of endurance. The faint lines at her eyes, the pale streaks in her hair, the curve of her mouth that could be both invitation and warning, all of it told the story of a woman who had learned to use fragility as armor. In her reflection, she did not see scandal or sanctity. She saw continuity. Behind her, the candles flickered in a slow rhythm like breaths. She thought of all the women who would come after her, those born into cages of duty, those measured by the wrong kind of gaze. She wished she could tell them, "The world will always try to witness you. Learn to witness yourself first." The following spring, Ferrara celebrated the festival of St. George. Streets burst with color, trumpets blared, and children ran with garlands of laurel and thyme. Lucrezia watched from her balcony, a soft shawl around her shoulders, the sound of laughter rising toward her like incense. She turned to Alfonso. "Do you hear it?" she asked. He nodded. "They're cheering for us." She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "They're cheering for themselves. We only reminded them they could." In her final years, she retreated often to a convent outside Ferrara, a place of silence and gardens where she copied manuscripts and tended herbs. But even there, her influence followed. Letters arrived from across Italy, Florence, Venice, even Rome. Requests for counsel, blessings, mediation. The Duchess of Ferrara had become something no papal decree could define, a living emblem of Renaissance humanity. When she died in 1519, the bells tolled not just for a noble woman, but for an idea. The city mourned not her absence, but the light she had cast, the way she had turned scandal into statecraft, rumor into legacy, humiliation into history. Decades later, when artists painted her likeness, they no longer placed her in bridal silk or papal robes. They painted her seated at a writing desk, ink-stained fingers resting on parchment, her gaze calm, distant, eternal. Behind her, the window opened to a sunrise over Ferrara, a new century glowing beyond. In the inscription below one such portrait were the words, Lucrezia Borgia, not infamous but illuminated. And perhaps that is how history redeems itself, not by erasing the darkness, but by showing how someone once trapped within it found a way to turn it into light. Because some stories are not about power seized or battles won. Some are about the quiet revolutions, the moments when endurance becomes elegance, when silence becomes strategy, and when a woman the world once sought to define instead writes her own ending. The Duchess of Ferrara did not escape her legend. She rewrote it. The years after Lucrezia Borgia's death unfolded like pages pressed between silence and rumor. She had left behind no manifesto, no loud declaration, only letters written in her steady, flowing hand, the kind of script that spoke softly but endured centuries. Ferrara mourned her with solemn grace. Bells tolled for 9 days, their echoes stretching over the river Pa and into the countryside where peasants paused in their fields to listen. The Duchess was gone, but her influence lingered like perfume on the air, subtle, unmistakable, impossible to wash away. In the great hall of the Palazzo Ducale, where frescoes caught the shifting light, Alfonso d'Este stood alone before her portrait. Painted in her final years, it showed Lucrezia seated at her writing desk, eyes calm, lips faintly curved, as if she were about to speak but had decided instead to let the world come to her. She always knew how to win without fighting, Alfonso murmured. Behind him, courtiers moved quietly, uncertain whether to approach. Ferrara had lost not only its duchess, but its compass. Beyond Ferrara's walls, the legends resumed their march. Rome, ever hungry for tales, resurrected the name Borgia with relish. Pamphleteers whispered of poison rings, forbidden love, and dark rites. The same city that once humiliated her could not resist using her again, this time as myth. But something had changed. Where once the stories dripped with condemnation, now they carried fascination. Artists painted her as a tragic beauty wronged by history. Scholars began to question the tales, finding no evidence for the crimes once pinned to her name. Poets reimagined her not as a temptress, but as a woman born into a world that feared intelligence wearing a woman's face. Slowly the myth bent toward mercy. In Ferrara's archives, her letters remained, carefully catalogued by monks and scholars who understood their worth. Her words were measured, never wasteful. Letters to Florence about diplomacy, to Venice about trade, to her son Ercole about kindness. In one she wrote, "Do not mistake silence for weakness. A wise voice waits for the right room to speak." It was advice meant for her child, but centuries later historians would read it as a manifesto for her entire life. Years turned to decades, decades to centuries. The world changed around her legacy. Empires rose and fell, wars redrew the map of Europe, but still her name remained, a whisper in cathedrals, a glint in galleries, a question in history books. Who was Lucrezia Borgia truly? The answer depended on who you asked. To some, she remained the dangerous daughter of a corrupt pope. To others, she was a Renaissance phoenix, burned by scandal, reborn through intellect. To women of later generations, she became a symbol of endurance, a proof that reputation could be rewritten by persistence rather than apology. What no one could deny was that she had outlasted her accusers. In the mid-1500s, a Florentine painter named Cristofano dell'Altissimo traveled to Ferrara to copy portraits of Italian nobility for a grand gallery commissioned by Cosimo I de' Medici. Among them was Lucrezia's likeness. When he finished, he reportedly stared at the painting for a long while and said, "She is smiling at time itself." His words proved prophetic. Generations later, in an age of Enlightenment scholars and candlelit salons, Lucrezia's name resurfaced not in gossip but in study. French historians began to re-evaluate the Borgia archives. They discovered that much of what had been written about her came from enemies of her father, the same men who had envied the Borgias' power and painted their downfall in venomous ink. Evidence emerged that Lucrezia had governed Ferrara efficiently, compassionately. She had negotiated trade routes, championed education for girls, and established funds for widows of soldiers. She had not been a puppet nor a poisoner but a ruler, one whose greatest weapon was grace under siege. By the 18th century, her image hung in galleries beside queens and saints. Painters captured her in candlelight, surrounded by scrolls and books, no longer the villainess of Rome's gossip, but the mother of Ferrara's golden age. In these paintings, her expression was not sorrowful or seductive, it was knowing. As if she understood that truth does not always win in its own century, but it never dies. In time, even the Vatican's tone shifted. Records once buried in suspicion were quietly re-examined. A cardinal historian, writing in the late 1800s, concluded, "If Lucrezia Borgia sinned, it was the sin of existing in an age that permitted no woman to be powerful without punishment." The line became famous, quoted in salons from Paris to London. Feminist writers of the early 20th century reclaimed her entirely. They saw in her not scandal but blueprint, a lesson in survival through self-discipline and quiet rebellion. To them, she was not a relic of decadence but a prototype of reinvention. Meanwhile, Ferrara continued to bear her mark. The palace gardens she had designed still bloomed each spring. The printing press she founded evolved into one of Italy's first centers of literary publication. Scholars uncovered manuscripts she had commissioned, translations of Greek philosophy, theological treatises on compassion, even recipes for herbal remedies that bore her annotations in the margins. It was as if every page she touched absorbed a little of her restraint, her luminous control. Visitors to Ferrara often spoke of a peculiar stillness in the city, a dignity that seemed to hang in the air like candle smoke. Some said it was her spirit, watching, patient, proud. And then came the modern age with its appetite for revision and rediscovery. Filmmakers, writers, historians, all sought to retell her story. Some dramatized her life in sweeping operas and tragic films. Others dissected her letters and policies. But the consensus grew clear. Beneath the rumor was a woman of immense intellect, empathy, and strategic brilliance. She had understood something few of her contemporaries ever could, that real power rarely announces itself. It whispers, it listens, it endures. The world finally caught up to what Lucrezia had known all along. Today, in Ferrara's Museo di Palazzo Schifanoia, her portrait still hangs in soft light. Her eyes, captured in oil nearly 500 years ago, seem alive, warm, distant, indestructible. Tourists stand before it in quiet awe, unsure whether they are looking at beauty, wisdom, or defiance. Perhaps they are looking at all three. History has a cruel habit of turning women into symbols. Some are flattened into saints, others into sinners. Lucrezia Borgia refused both roles. She was neither redemption nor ruin. She was simply real, and that, in her world, was the greatest rebellion of all. The myth once used to diminish her had become her monument. The legend of scandal became the legend of survival. Even now, 5 centuries later, her story continues to ripple, through the paintings, the music, the scholars who still debate her legacy. Every generation finds a different reflection of itself in her. Ambition, grace, endurance, contradiction. And maybe that is her truest immortality. Because Lucrezia Borgia did not live to be understood. She lived to be remembered. And in that, she succeeded beyond every limit they set for her. The night in Ferrara falls like a sigh. The river glimmers under a crescent moon, the same current that carried the reflections of her city 5 centuries ago. Inside the quiet museum that now occupies what was once the palace of the Este family, the world moves and whispers. Footsteps echo softly across marble floors. The air smells faintly of old paper and beeswax, of time itself lingering in the walls. At the far end of the long gallery hangs her portrait, Lucrezia Borgia, Duchess of Ferrara, daughter of a pope, legend of light and shadow. The oil has darkened with age, yet her face remains untouched by the centuries. Her eyes, amber and knowing, follow the viewer with that familiar paradox. Calm in command, intellect in melancholy. A young visitor, a student perhaps, stands before the painting, his phone lowered, his expression quietly awed. He's read about her in half-truths and myths, seen her name buried in paragraphs about poison and scandal. Yet now, under this golden light, none of that feels true. She doesn't look like the villain history promised. She looks alive. He studies the brushstrokes, the soft curve of her smile, the ink-stained fingers resting on parchment, the glow on her cheek as if painted from memory rather than presence. And in that silence he feels something like connection. He whispers under his breath, "They lied about you, didn't they?" 5 centuries earlier, Ferrara had done what Rome could not. It had listened to a woman's silence and learned to translate it. Lucrezia had built her power not from conquest, but from endurance. In her world, women were painted either as saints or sirens, with no language for intelligence that was gentle or strength that was quiet. She wrote her own language. That was her rebellion, not war, not seduction, but redefinition. In a time when survival meant obedience, she made resilience into a kind of authorship. She mastered how to be seen and unseen, how to turn spectacle into strategy, how to transform gossip into a crown she could wear without apology. And in the centuries that followed, she outlived her myth. The curators in Ferrara often say that the portrait of Lucrezia is different at every hour of the day. At sunrise, her gaze looks hopeful, as if watching a future she will never see. At noon, it seems commanding, almost regal. And at night, when the gallery empties and the only light comes from the moon filtering through glass, she looks tired but triumphant, like someone who has carried her story far enough for others to find it. Some say the expression changes because of the aging paint. Others believe it's the light. But those who've spent years with her portrait know better. It's not the painting that changes. It's the world catching up to her. If you stand close enough, you can see the fine detail, the letters carved faintly into the wooden frame. In Luce Resurgo, I rise again in the light. No one knows who added it. Some claim it was Alfonso, her husband. Others think it was a later restorer, moved by the power of her legend. Either way, the inscription fits. Lucrezia Borgia rose again, not in body but in memory. Today her name adorns streets, academies, even wines and operas. Her life inspires novels, films, dissertations. But what endures beyond the interpretations is the essence of what she represented. That the measure of a life is not in the myths told about it, but in the quiet revolutions it leaves behind. She began as a pawn in her father's game, a name traded for alliances, a beauty displayed like a coin. She ended as a sovereign of perception, a duchess who transformed a city through intellect, diplomacy, and grace. In between, there was humiliation, endurance, and transformation. That journey, from scandal to sovereignty, became her real coronation. There is a story the Ferrara guides like to tell. They say that when Lucrezia's coffin was opened for restoration in the late 19th century, her bones were found wrapped in a silk cloth embroidered with Latin verses. The words translated roughly to, "May the world remember not my pain but my patience." No historian can verify it. The cloth, if it ever existed, vanished in another century's fire. But it feels true because it sounds like her. The patience of a woman who learned that time itself could be her ally. That silence, when wielded with precision, can outlast accusation. That the truest kind of revenge is not correction, but continuance. Outside the museum, the bells of Ferrara ring softly. Their echoes drift across the rooftops, over cobbled streets where her footsteps once fell. The same air she breathed, the same city she shaped, it still moves to her rhythm. Somewhere, a musician plays a fragment of a Renaissance hymn she once commissioned. The melody swells and fades like breath, the kind of music made not for triumph but remembrance. And within that sound lives the quiet truth she left behind. You cannot destroy what redefines itself. If one were to write the final line of her story, it might not be about power at all. It would be about freedom, not the kind that shouts from balconies or raises flags, but the kind that sits at a desk, dips a quill in ink, and writes a sentence the world is not yet ready to hear. Because that is what Lucrezia Borgia did. She wrote herself into history's margins, then waited patiently for history to read her properly. Now, 500 years later, the world has finally turned the page. The student in the museum takes one last look at the portrait before leaving. The lights dim slightly, reflecting on the glass case that holds one of her surviving letters. In elegant script, the ink still visible after centuries, it reads, "To endure is to win without battle." He takes a photo, not for social media but for memory, and steps out into the night. The moon above Ferrara shines pale and forgiving. Somewhere in the wind, the faintest whisper seems to follow him, a voice that belongs not to myth but to a woman who understood the mathematics of survival. Power fades. Beauty fades. But meaning endures. Long after the doors close, the museum returns to stillness. The moonlight drapes the gallery in silver. For a moment, the portrait of Lucrezia Borgia seems almost alive again, the candlelight of memory dancing across her painted face. If she could speak, perhaps she would not defend herself. Perhaps she would simply say, "Now you finally see me." And in that single silent sentence lies the legacy of her entire life. A truth carved not in marble or decree, but in endurance, intellect, and grace. Because Lucrezia Borgia was never the villain of her story. She was the author. And as long as her name is spoken, whispered, or written in light, her story will never end. The gallery fades to black, the music softens, and only the glow of Lucrezia Borgia's portrait remains. The narrator's voice returns, not as historian but as witness. 500 years ago she was a rumor. Tonight she's a reminder. The camera moves slowly toward the painting, Her eyes luminous under glass, her hand frozen over parchment as if she's about to write one last line. We talk about Lucrezia Borgia as though she belonged to another world, but her world is still ours. Different names, different tools, the same hunger for stories, especially the ones told about women before they can tell their own. Every generation has its Lucrezia. A woman defined by whispers before she has a chance to speak. A woman who learns that silence can be louder than defense. A woman who discovers that power, when worn quietly, lasts longer than noise. Her story isn't just Renaissance history, it's a map of survival. Imagine being born into a dynasty where love is political currency. Imagine learning that your beauty is a weapon, your body a contract, your reputation a battleground. And then imagine finding a way to turn all of that, every humiliation, every rumor, into art, policy, and peace. That is what Lucrezia did. She didn't destroy the system. She outthought it. Cut to footage of modern Ferrara. Cafes under the shadow of the old palazzo, students on bicycles, the same cobbled streets she once walked. The voice continues. She turned scandal into scholarship. She turned survival into strategy. And she turned her silence into a language the world would eventually learn to read. It's a message for every creator, every thinker, every person still trying to reclaim their narrative in a world that wants to tell it for them. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell it. Now the scene transitions into something abstract, dreamlike. Centuries collapsing. Lucrezia's candle becomes a laptop screen. Her quill becomes a camera lens. Her letters become the comments, essays, and posts of millions of people writing themselves into permanence. The narration slows. When she wrote, her words crossed mountains by horse. When we write, ours cross oceans in seconds. But the purpose is the same, to be seen, truly seen, before the noise rewrites us. This is the moment where the viewer realizes the documentary isn't about the past anymore. It's about now. The shot widens, a classroom where a young woman studies Renaissance politics, an artist sketching Lucrezia's portrait on an iPad, a filmmaker editing scenes of her story, a historian reading her letters aloud in Italian, her voice trembling. Every generation finds her again, the narrator says, because we need her again. Lucrezia Borgia's life teaches us three truths. First, reputation is a weapon you don't control, but dignity is armor you build yourself. She lost control of the first. She mastered the second. Second, power is not always visible. It lives in patience, in strategy, in the ability to make endurance look like elegance. Third, legacy is not what people say about you. It's what still moves when you're gone. Ferrara still moves. So does her story. Fade to a slow pan of her surviving letters. Ink faded, words steady. Each one begins the same way, to whom this may concern in the name of peace. Peace. Not ambition. Not revenge. Peace. She could have vanished into bitterness. Instead, she made peace her empire. And that's what greatness often looks like, not the fire that burns, but the light that stays. The tone lifts now, urging reflection. If you've ever been misjudged, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had to build yourself from ashes other people left behind, then her story belongs to you. Images flash like memories. Women in laboratories, leaders in offices, writers at night under dim light, each facing their own form of scrutiny, each carrying her echo. She reminds us that resilience isn't loud. It's deliberate. It's choosing to stand again, not to prove others wrong, but to prove yourself right. The narrator's voice softens, almost confessional. Maybe that's why I wanted to tell her story. Because it isn't about saints or sinners. It's about the space between them, where most of us live. The shot cuts to the portrait once more. The camera draws close until only her eyes fill the frame. They tried to write her ending. She wrote beyond it. Now the music swells, strings low and warm, carrying both grief and triumph. The screen fades to archival footage. Pages of her letters turning, city bells ringing, the same moon rising over Ferrara. The narrator continues. So when you hear her name, don't think of poison or scandal. Think of patience. Think of intelligence disguised as grace. Think of every person who ever rebuilt their name from fragments. Because that's what she did, and she left us the blueprint. A call to action, intimate yet universal. Tell stories like hers. Protect names like hers. And when history offers you a woman wrapped in rumor, look again. There might be a revolution hiding in her silence. Final sequence. Ferrara at sunrise. Golden light spills over rooftops, birds crossing the sky. The camera moves slowly through the city, across courtyards, over cobblestones, through the great hall where her portrait hangs. The voice, one last time. She lived in the age of shadows and built a language of light. She was accused of everything but credited with nothing, until now. And if this story has reached you, then her work is not finished, because every listener becomes the next storyteller. Every witness becomes part of her legacy. The screen fades to black. A single sentence appears in elegant white script. Lucrezia Borgia, not infamous but illuminated. Then below it the call to action. Share her light. Rewrite the myths. Tell the story's history forgot. Music fades into the sound of a quill scratching paper. Soft, rhythmic, eternal. The final whisper. Her story isn't over. It just found another voice, yours.